getting started. I can start introducing you.
Yep, sounds good.
Awesome. Great. Okay. Well, good evening, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming to Be More Beautiful's Habitat Gardening for Birds in Baltimore workshop in deep collaboration with the Baltimore Audubon Society. So just so everyone knows, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. Also, will be sent out to all registered participants. So if you don't want to be in the recording, it shouldn't be an issue, but feel free to keep your camera off, in that case. And yeah, so before we begin tonight's workshop, I just want to tell you a little bit about Be More Beautiful if you haven't heard of us before. We're a city-led peer-to-peer beautification program. Our goal is to not only change behaviors and attitudes towards the beautification of our city, but to also encourage residents, businesses, and organizations to become directly involved in activities and projects that keep their neighborhoods clean. So to meet this goal, we work closely with communities on their unique beautification projects and cleanliness challenges, as well as provide educational literature, workshops, outreach material, and other resources that residents can use to keep Baltimore beautiful. So yeah, after this workshop, everyone will receive a link to our website with more information about our mission and yeah, some grants we have available for cultivating urban green space in Baltimore City. So just a few housekeeping requests. Please make sure your microphone is on mute while our speakers are presenting. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat or save them for the end. So our presentation will be about an hour long, correct me if I'm wrong, Erin, with a 30-minute question and answer period at the end. Um, yeah, and so tonight we are delighted to be joined by our facilitator, Erin Reed Miller. Erin is the Senior Coordinator of Urban Conservation for the Baltimore program of Audubon Mid-Atlantic, part of the National Audubon Society. Erin earned her MS in Wildlife Ecology from the University of Delaware, where she researched the connection between native plant species and insect communities with Dr. Doug Tallamy. And she has taught bird-friendly gardening workshops for a decade and works alongside Baltimore communities to thoughtfully increase public accessible biodiverse green spaces. And just also to mention, we're joined by Susie Creamer, the director of the Audubon's Baltimore program, who is in the chat and will be gathering questions for um, our Q&A at the end of the workshop. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for being here, Erin and Susie. And yeah, feel free to take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks so much for inviting us to do this workshop tonight. Really excited to talk to everybody about habitat gardening, even though it's December. It was a particularly chilly one out there today in Baltimore, and so you might be thinking, oh my gosh, we're talking about gardening in December. Like, what is going on? So, I have to tell you, and this is not really part of my presentation later, so I wanted to tell you that you are actually all geniuses for being at a habitat gardening workshop in December. If you didn't already know that you were a genius, I'm telling you that you're a genius because now is the perfect time to plan our gardens. Yes, of course, gardeners know that we do that over the winter, but if you are hoping to replace some turf grass, some areas of your yard, if you have a yard with some habitat plantings and all the things that we're going to talk about in the next hour, then now is actually the best time to put down all that mulch and smother that turf grass and let it sit for several months so that you can plant right through that mulch in the spring next year or, anytime actually throughout the growing season next year. So you are a genius for being at a habitat gardening workshop in December. So backing up a little bit, Morgan mentioned that I'm the urban conservation coordinator for the Baltimore program of National Audubon Society, and I've been thinking about native plants and their connections to our local ecosystems for a long time, suffice it to say. And while that is the case, I have struggled with the title of this presentation, Habitat Gardening, because gardening is something that perhaps a lot of us consider ourselves, to do, but it has this very kind of hobbyist quality to the word, right? So, like, a gardener sounds like something we do, in our pastime, and maybe there's some science to it, but it just sort of sounds like something that we tinker around outside. Um, and use it to pass our time. So just as a little kind of Zoom practice, I was wondering if we could look for that reaction button. So on your Zoom toolbar, I want you to press that reaction button and hit the heart emoji if you consider yourself to be an experienced gardener,
Hey,
or
Erin.
maybe,
Erin, the
oh,
toolbar is not the same as we're used to. Pardon me. Hi, everyone. This is Susie from Audubon.
oh,
I don't
sorry. I
see
wanted to.
the re I don't see the reactions. I was trying to give one earlier, and I don't see it. Am I missing something, Morgan?
It's not
Um,
important. I was really just getting us excited, but if the reactions aren't part of our wheelhouse tonight, I do see raised hands, so that's cool. Okay, so raise your hand if you consider yourself an experienced gardener. Okay, and then put your hands down. And then even if you're an aspirational gardener, you can raise your hand. So the point is that there's lots of reasons that people garden, right? It's a great hobby. This is my backyard and my doggy. So, we do this little hobby that we call gardening for lots of different reasons. If we were in a room together and chatting, I might ask us to go around and share all the different reasons that we like to garden. But since we're not in person together, I might guess that those reasons might include growing whole foods, being outside and getting fresh air and exercise. Maybe gardening is part of our traditions or our culture or something that we grew up with. Maybe we garden because we want our outdoor spaces to be beautiful and it makes us happy to be out there. So, whatever the purpose is of whatever we're doing out there, all of that tinkering and putzing around, whether out there in your garden looks something like this image or whether it looks like something else entirely. The point is that the choices that we make in our gardening, our landscaping, the plants that we choose and how we choose to arrange them, how we care for those outdoor spaces, all of those choices have hemispheric consequences. And that is because birds are hemispheric. So here in North America, about 70% of our bird species are migratory, which means that they're only spending part of their time here in the Northern Hemisphere, and then other parts of the year they're moving throughout the hemisphere. So they're traveling up and down along the flyways. So I love showing this map. It's a screenshot of an online tool that any of you can access, maybe later, maybe not right now. This tool is called the Migration Bird Explorer, and it's really neat because you can choose a specific bird species or a specific location, and then see how birds connect us to places throughout the hemisphere. And we can imagine the little individual birds traveling between Baltimore and Maryland and the rest of the Americas. So the choices that we're making in our landscaping impact these migratory birds in particular because, they're flying along and they're trying to find places that they can stop to rest and refuel along their migratory journeys. So just a little bit of background about what Audubon is doing and working to protect all of these species in addition to our resident bird species. We've been in Baltimore for over 20 years now, so we're very much used to working with coalitions and community partners and neighbors just like you to achieve all of our shared goals. So, in a nutshell, we are working to create and sustain publicly accessible bird habitats. So, all of those beautiful green spaces in your parks throughout the city, Audubon Mid-Atlantic has a policy agenda that's focused on investing in natural infrastructure and climate solutions. And then we're always trying to engage Baltimore communities in conservation actions, advocacy, things that are going to improve our city for birds and people in the places that we live. So back to our migratory birds. If we imagine one of those birds flying over Baltimore during peak migration season, spring or fall, there are literally millions of birds flying over the city of Baltimore in any given night. And I'm just going to repeat that because it sounds kind of shocking. Any given night during peak migration city season, there could be a million, over a million, millions of birds flying over the city of Baltimore. So any one of those millions of birds could land anywhere. And we know that Baltimore is full of amazing green spaces. This is outside of our office in Southeast Baltimore. This is Patterson Park. But those amazing green spaces come in all different shapes and sizes. This is a yard in the Northwood neighborhood. So all of these birds could land literally anywhere. And they are hopefully going to be able to find the things that they need to rest and regain their strength, maybe regain some calories before continuing along their migratory journeys. I don't like to spend too much time on the doom and gloom because I know that we're all here to learn how to improve our outdoor spaces. But this is a really important issue that we need to work collectively to solve. Because according to a report that was published in 2019, we have lost almost 3 billion birds since the year 1970. So that means that bird populations are not replacing themselves. Of those 2.9 billion birds that we've lost, 2.5 billion of those are migratory species. So that means that in the span of one human lifetime, we've lost this many birds. If you find yourself walking outside and hearing fewer birds than when you were younger, this could be the case. And you can see in this graphic that Baltimore Orioles, we have lost about 2 in 5 of our Baltimore Orioles since the year 1970. So, enough with the doom and gloom. Birds are telling us it's time to act. And that is why we are here. So my first slide, my first piece of advice is on how not to kill birds. So before we get to the gardening, let's just talk about the simple actions that we can do to try not to kill birds. Because the last thing we want to do after we create this, urban oasis in our outdoor spaces, the last thing we want to do is lure those birds into a death trap caused by outdoor cats, caused by window strikes, caused by invasive plants. We're not going to go into any one of these topics super closely, but suffice it to say that lots of things are aiding the decline of our bird populations. I will highlight the fact that climate change is the #1 threat to birds. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor moving around. Let me know. If not, I can get out a laser pointer. But in this map
No, we
of,
cannot. Sorry to
you
interrupt. No,
cannot.
we cannot see it. Apologies.
Thank you. Alrighty, so we have in this map the current range of a Baltimore Oriole. All right, this black outline is its current range. We can see that it includes Baltimore right down here. The Baltimore Oriole's range is predicted to shift this much further north, this dark gray area, by the year 2080. And so the problem with that for our birds is that their ranges may shrink or shift to places that might not contain the parts of their habitat that they need. And also, really sad for us in Baltimore that the Baltimore Orioles range will no longer include the state of Maryland. So our gardens are acting as carbon sinks. That's amazing. And we are additionally helping those birds be able to find their habitat needs if we are including the things that we're going to talk about tonight in our outdoor spaces. Finally, just on this point, we can probably also experience the effect of climate change being city dwellers here. Is making our habitat unbearable as well. So this map is showing the parts of the city that are up to 12 degrees hotter than surrounding ambient temperature. So the deeper red means it's even hotter. And we can definitely see the correlation between heat and a lack of green space, right? The denser the buildings and streets and impervious surfaces, the hotter an area is going to be. If you're familiar with the city, then you can see that these spaces that are not red, meaning that they are ambient temperature or cooler, represent areas of the city that are greener. So Legan Park is right over here. Druid Hill Park is right here. We can even see the very squarish outline of Patterson Park right down here. And then we also are aware that there's a correlation between heat, lack of green space, and also poverty and crime rates. And so addressing climate change, addressing those green spaces in our city is an ecological issue as well as an environmental justice issue. So how does it look to combat these threats to birds, both the ecological threats and the social threats, by adding habitat to our own gardens and communities? And importantly, make it cute because just letting your turf grass grow isn't going to cut it, people. We need to make sure that this is a movement that catches on, and we want it to be beautiful. We still want to be able to achieve those gardening goals of being surrounded by beautiful green spaces. So I have 5 rules for us. Okay, I'm not going to call them rules because that sounds like I'm playing teacher, but 5 goals and guidelines that if we are able to follow these, some of them are things that you can do right away. Some of these are things that kind of are going to guide your choices over time, not things that you're going to do in a weekend, but sort of 5 guidelines to follow as we are increasing the amount of bird-friendly habitat in our gardens. So, guideline number 1 is plant native plants. The reason that we have to plant native plants actually has less to do with those native plants' direct connection with birds and than it does their direct connection with insects. So, for example, the insect in this picture is a spice bush swallowtail caterpillar, and it is happily munching on a spice bush. It's able to digest the chemicals in that spice bush, the chemicals that that plant uses to defend itself, because it has co-evolved over evolutionary time to be able to do that. 90% of our herbivorous insects are specialists, just like this spice bush swallowtail. And that means that by planting native plants, we are kind of connecting that ancient food chain, making sure that the sun's energy can get into plants and that that energy can be passed along to insects and to the rest of the food chain. Most of the time, a food chain starts with an insect. So, first guideline is about planting native plants. And now you might be sitting there thinking, well, wait a minute. I thought we were talking about birds. Why are we suddenly talking about insects? Well, to answer that question, we have to dive into the bird food pyramid a little bit. So, birds eat a variety of things throughout the course of the year, throughout their life cycle, but 96% of terrestrial bird species eat insects at some point in their life. So it's an incredibly important source of protein, especially for our nestlings, baby birds who are just learning to fly. Of course, we want our gardens to include things like berries. Berries from native plants have higher fat content than berries from non-native species. We, of course, want to be providing dried seeds and stalks in our garden. This is a good time of year to talk about that because your garden is probably starting to look a little bit dead. I still have one species of plant blooming in my garden right now. And if anybody also has a plant blooming in their garden, please put it into the chat and then we will have a late bloomer off later. So this is an important time of year to remember that by, maintaining those dried seed heads, retaining those stalks in the landscape over the winter, it's going to be an important way for us to be able to feed our overwintering birds, give our insects somewhere to lay their eggs and overwinter as well so that they can emerge in the spring. We want our gardens to be full of beautiful blooming things. We want to attract pollinators, the insect kind, as well as our hummingbirds. But the most important thing that we need for a bird-friendly habitat is insects. I am going to give you an example right now. So this plant on the left is a very beautiful, I have to admit, very beautiful ornamental plant. It has these gorgeous berries. You might even see them in the landscape right now. This plant is Nandina domestica, heavenly bamboo. When we plant Nandina domestica, we are feeding exactly 0 species of caterpillars. I think the horticulture industry likes to call that pest free. So, you know, that's fine, I guess, if we want a sterile landscape. But I suspect that the reason we are here is because we want to entice a diversity of organisms. And so, alternatively, we could plant vaccinium, our native blueberries. There's a high bush and a low bush variety. We also have native cranberries in the vaccinium genus. And that genus just alone is a host plant for almost 300 different species of caterpillars, which become beautiful moths and butterflies. So that is just one example, comparison between these two genera. But on average, native plants support about 13 times more caterpillar species than plants that evolved elsewhere. And I know at this point I am beating the dead horse, but a very important example to demonstrate the importance of all of these caterpillars is the fact that it takes upwards of 5,000 caterpillars to feed just one nestful of chicks, even for a bird as small as our little chickadee here. There are several studies that show that some birds require up to 70% of their surrounding landscape to be native species in order to successfully breed and rear their young. So, rule number one, this one I'm going to say is a rule. Rule number one is plant native plants. All right, guideline number two is we're going to attempt to reduce the amount of lawn or paved surfaces in our outdoor spaces by half. And we're going to do that in kind of like a tricky brain way. So, often, when we're thinking about how to landscape our outdoor spaces, we're thinking about where to put plants. Instead of that, I would encourage us to think about where we want to walk, where we want to do different outdoor activities, and put lawn there or patio there, and fill in plants everywhere else. So we are essentially creating these outdoor rooms and hallways, just like this property in the Hamilton neighborhood. So we can see some of our outdoor rooms here. There's an outdoor dining space. This is in the backyard. There's an outdoor bird feeder station space. We can call that an activity area. And then there are these paths kind of, connecting these different outdoor activity areas. And all of these paths and outdoor rooms are surrounded by plants. So in this way, we're able to kind of fill in those spaces. It doesn't happen overnight. We have to make a plan. So our plan is to first map out your property. If you really want to dive into this as kind of an exercise, we'll make sure that you get on our mailing list and we do longer versions of this workshop in the spring. But map out your property. There's lots of online tools that you can use to do that. My favorite is not an online tool, it's graphing paper. Map out your property, add in those activity areas, really just draw them on. Or any existing elements, things that are not going to be moving around in your landscape, things like jungle gym, shed, existing plantings, vegetable garden. And then connect those activity areas with walkways. Does not matter to the birds or insects what shape those walkways take. This kind of curved path lends itself to a very naturalistic landscape, but they're not going to notice if they are flying across a right angle in a straight line or a curved line. So it's really, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So kind of once we have these outdoor activity areas and they're connected by pathways, then over time, maybe, it's a 1 foot strip at a time, we're going to work in from the edges with our plants. So, starting on the edges, This is what I actually did in my yard over the years. Every year I'm kind of adding a little bit more. This is why we have a plan in advance. Okay, so we know where we're going. We're not just kind of adding things willy-nilly, but we're working in from the edges until we finally have those outdoor rooms. Finally, it'll be time to think about what kinds of species are going to grow in these spaces. And that's when you start to think about different kinds of site conditions, the sun direction, topography, if there are things like buildings shading the space, the moisture of the soil, the percolation of the soil. This is the point when people tend to get overwhelmed because that sounds like, a lot to know about your property. But more than likely, even if you have a very small outdoor space, your garden is a collection of micro habitats. And so you can really kind of zoom in on one area at a time and think about, what are the conditions in just this one space? So, for example, this planting right here, it's against a north-facing wall. It's probably going to get shaded for most of the day until the late afternoon, and then maybe it'll get a little bit of shade from this tree, or maybe it'll get some direct sunlight. So, things like that. It's very easy to think about the conditions for just this one space rather than the property as a whole. But again, that's an exercise for our longer workshop. So, back to our long-term goals and guidelines. And this is probably the topic that I want to spend the most time on with you all. So by now we've dedicated ourselves and our lives to planting native plant species. We've started to get a better idea of where we want to plant. We have it sort of, mapped out. And now we need to figure out how to arrange those plants. So layering is actually the most critical piece of your habitat design when it comes to supporting a diversity of species. And when I talk about these layers, we can kind of fit that into the outdoor rooms analogy by thinking about these layers of plants like the rooms and, ground covers, walls, and ceilings of those outdoor rooms. So the reason that the layers of vegetation are such a critical part of habitat design is because it is the largest contributor to animal biodiversity. Each layer of vegetation within a habitat represents different niches for different species to occupy. So if you live somewhere where you have a canopy layer, this kind of overstory tall trees layer, then you've probably seen different kinds of raptors like hawks or owls. Those are species that you're never really going to see kind of flitting. Well, okay, sometimes. Most often, you are not going to see them kind of flitting around on branches or, scurrying around on the ground. They need those tall spaces where they can perch, and be able to look down and search for their prey. Similarly, in the understory along the trunks of trees, that's where you're going to support your woodpeckers, your nuthatches, all of those cavity nesting birds that need, a certain diameter of trunk to be able to, build their cavity nests within a hole in the tree. Once you get down into this shrub layer and you're getting into kind of the berries and this kind of like bushier, denser vegetation, then you're starting to see, some sparrows, and your hummingbirds are going to be coming to the tops of flowers, your finches. And then finally, on the ground cover layer is where you'll see wrens and thrushes and sparrows kind of scratching around, foraging in the leaf litter. So this is a very simple illustration. I've used it for years and years and years because it's so beautifully, especially if you're somebody who's at all familiar with where you tend to see some of these birds. You can start to see, oh yeah, okay, well, if I'm missing an understory layer, then I'm really going to miss out on these types of species. So, in order to kind of put this ecological premise into a habitat design conversation, I highly recommend checking out this book called Planting in a Post-Wild World. It's by Thomas Rainer and Claudia West. So they kind of break these different layers apart and allow you to think about both, their ecological function of each layer and each plant within the layer, as well as their design function. So we're starting to see how the layers mimic a plant community, how they kind of work together, and how they support biodiversity and how they make our gardens look beautiful. So let's go through the layers. I'm realizing I haven't taken a pause. Maybe Susie just kind of flagged me if there are like dying questions that I need to pause to answer
There's
before I dive into the layers.
There's not, no, this is great. There's not a dying question. And folks, again, please feel free to put them in the chat. I can repost what I said at the beginning. I would just say if you wanted to comment now or save it for later, but there was a comment about containers also having value for
Yeah.
habitat. So just want to make sure that was coming up soon or later in the slideshow.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. And yes, I mean, we've done this workshop in Baltimore City for lots of years and very aware of the fact that not everybody has a yard. I'm not sure if I kept that slide in this presentation. So you've noticed I've mentioned other workshops. This presentation tonight is kind of a condensed version of workshops that we do frequently in the spring. But I definitely have a slide in that presentation that shows an example of the plant layers I'm talking about, but in containers. So we can definitely talk through some of those species maybe of plants if that would be helpful. And then we're definitely going to leave you with one of our resources, which I haven't brought up yet, but I will because I always do. But yes, thank you for bringing up that important point. So also, if you notice that I'm talking really quickly, it's because this is a condensed version of this presentation. So, all right, so let's go through the layers. When it comes to designing our garden, and I realize this is not like a design workshop, but I think it's kind of helpful to think about things this way. When we start trying to choose what species we want to plant in the different layers, it's helpful to kind of plan our design from the top down. All right, so as we're going through these layers, we're actually going to start at the very top, and that is because the plants underneath in the lower layers are going to be impacted by, namely shaded by, the layers above them. So in Planting in a Post-Wild World, um, Thomas Rainer and Claudia West describe this structural layer. And continuing with our outdoor rooms analogy, we can think of these plants as the studs of our walls of our outdoor rooms. So, of course, these are things like, trees and shrubs, but also some really tall herbaceous plants. This illustration has what I assume is a Joe Pyeweed, one of my favorite native perennial species. But things like, our really tall switchgrasses, ironweed, some of these native herbaceous plants get, 8 feet tall. We can think of those as being in the structural layer too. Um, I mentioned, our design and how we're, kind of choosing different plant species, but I did want to make one plea that when we are thinking of that topmost layer, if you have room in your outdoor space, or maybe you're thinking about a larger space like your local park or your schoolyard, if you have room for canopy trees, I would encourage you to choose the most ecologically productive species. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. I hope I don't get too much pushback when I say this, but in terms of design and what we see, tall trees don't really have a lot of design function because they're way up here, right? Like we're standing down on the ground, we're looking forward, we might see, beautiful bark, we might appreciate some, fall foliage. We might have opinions about what types of like nuts or fruits we want or don't want to be falling. But mostly these, trees, they have things going on up above where we can't see. And so I would encourage us to focus on the most productive species as opposed to thinking about, what they look like so much. By productive, I mean the ones that feed the most insects. So this is where our top 10 lists come in really handy. Top 10 tree genera include the oaks, the willows, the cherries, the hickories. These are um, groups of plants that serve as hosts for hundreds of species of insects. So incredibly ecologically important, and just are going to support so many more, like orders of magnitude uh, more biodiversity than other species. So keystone species, we're going to focus our canopy layer on keystone species is what I'm saying. As we get down closer to the ground and we start thinking about our understory or our shrub layer, these are really, kind of the walls of our outdoor rooms. These are the things that we see. And so we can kind of start here when we start designing and choosing things that we really, want to be surrounded by and we think are really beautiful. So as we come down from the structural layer, the next layer that is described is the seasonal theme layer. And these are essentially our seasonally blooming perennial plants. When it comes to choosing species to plant in this layer, it can be really challenging just because this layer is so much more diverse than the other layers. There are just more species of herbaceous plants than there are of woody plants. So we have lots of choices when it comes to color and texture and form and fragrance, all of these different things that we can think about when we're trying to choose which seasonally blooming plants to plant. I would say the critical thing for attracting our insects, our pollinators, and our birds is to attempt to have an overlapping sequence of bloom throughout the growing season. So this is going to make sure that there's a continual source of nectar or a source of seeds, and also something making our gardens look really beautiful for as long as possible. Some species, native species, you'll find have really long growing seasons. You can find species that'll bloom for a couple of months, and then other species might only bloom for a couple of weeks. And so, really trying to be intentional, writing down or making note of the bloom times when you're choosing species and trying to have, if you can sort of think of them as a calendar, something blooming all the time. So, lots of examples of plants that would fall into this seasonal theme layer. These are mostly the plants that people think of when they think of it, native plants. So our goldenrods, our asters, our sunflowers, our coneflowers. I think this illustration has, echinacea and some liatris, blazing star, black-eyed Susans, milkweeds, like all of those things that are blooming at different points in time. Okay, so for a lot of people, this is where they stop, right? Like we plant our trees, everybody loves trees, and then we plant our seasonally blooming things, and then we fill in all the remaining space with mulch, right? No, 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 no. Okay, so this is the oft forgotten but super important ground cover layer. We can think of this layer as the green mulch, and it's what's going to take your habitat garden from like a 7.5 to a 10, right? So the plants that we plant in between, in betwixt all of those seasonally blooming plants are what's going to be responsible for stormwater management, erosion control, weed control, fill those niches, right? All of those things that we think of as being the job of mulch, which like mulch still has its place. Um, my kind of rule is that if I establish a planting, if I plant an area And, I'm using mulch, of course, in the first year or so to, retain soil moisture. And when the plants haven't established yet and they're itty bitty, if I can still see that mulch after 3 or 4 years, it means I haven't planted densely enough. All right. So we're going to talk about planting densely next, but suffice to say, we're filling in all of those spaces between these plants with our ground cover layer. And then because nature refuses to be categorized, of course, there are exceptions to these layers, and we might call these the fillers, right? So these are species that don't really fit nicely into any one of these layer categories, but they might be species that are really opportunistic growers. They might disappear for a couple years and then they'll pop up where you did some overzealous weeding and created an empty niche over here. Over time, the ideal scenario is that you improve the seed bank where you are planting in such a way that when you have a little, disruption, something dies, then you have species like these fillers hiding in the seed bank that can pop up in that space that are not competitive, they're not persistent, they are going to get crowded out, but then they'll pop up somewhere else. So if you've ever planted cardinal flower or columbine or blue mist flower, then you know that those are plants that, they're nice to have around, they're gorgeous, and then suddenly, like, where did they go? And then 2 years later, they're back. Okay, so we're planting native plants. We are creating outdoor rooms. We are planting in layers of vegetation. This is kind of my last guideline before we get to the make it cute guideline. And that is about clustering these plants as densely as possible. And I realize that this is, everything I'm saying is like, yeah, sounds so easy. Just like plant in groups of 5 or 10. Like I know how much plants cost. So again, this is something that we can do over time. And this is a guideline. Um, but my advice is to avoid the plant zoo. Okay, so ideally we're not choosing, like one of these and one of those. We are planting in clusters as opposed to specimens. So the kind of horticulture name for this, the landscape design name for this is massing, excuse me, or drifting. This is going to make foraging a lot more efficient for our pollinators. Sorry, before I get to the pollinators, I have kind of a diagram. Really easy to see the difference when we're kind of contrasting these two spaces. So, traditional planting plan, we have these sad individual plants separated by gallons and gallons of mulch. In our diagram down here, we have, these large swaths of all one species, 30 of this one, 35 of this one, 25 of this one. There's lots of room in between these individual plants for weeds to grow, for mulch to get washed away in the next big storm. This is a really just vulnerable landscape. This landscape, this plant community landscape, is highly resilient. Okay, so we have these clusters. If you can kind of see species X and species triangle are kind of planted in these clusters and then all filled in between with these ground cover plants. So there's no exposed soil here. There's no exposed mulch here. There's a really high density of vegetation, which means that there's no room for weeds, and it's really just resistant to getting washed away or for, resistant to any other kind of disturbance. The reason this works is because plants' roots are reaching to different depths and widths below the soil. So, for example, you might, by, let's see, well, I was going to pick on the echinacea, but it has these two sad little roots. So let's go over here. We're going to call this one some kind of goldenrod. Okay, so we went and we bought some solidago. We're about to plant it, and the label says it has to be planted, 20 inches, 2 feet apart from each other. So that is true. If I were going to plant two of this exact same plant, I would want to keep them, I would want to give them enough space for them to grow to their maximum size. But if we do that and leave and plant nothing in between them, then that is, where we get that space for weeds to grow. So we can plant these really, really densely. The roots are going to kind of expand out and, um, kind of become intermixed under the ground, the same way as would happen in, a native meadow or a native forest. I certainly have never seen a meadow with plants separated by 18 inches of mulch. Okay, so I've already mentioned all of those things. And then, yes, when we clump these plants together, it makes it a lot more efficient for our pollinators, for our seed eaters. This little bumblebee is going to kind of like one type of flower at a time. And if the plants are planted in a cluster, then it's not wasting a whole lot of energy kind of flying between those blooms. So in the wild, does this look like anybody's yard? In the wild, this density of layered plants looks like this. So, when we go into a forest, this is clearly a forest that doesn't have an overabundance of deer, by the way. When we go into a forest, we can see these layers really obviously, and there's even layers within the layers in a forest. And then similarly in a meadow. So we can see our seasonally blooming plants, they're planted in clusters. And then we also have these clumps of ground cover plants that are planted in between them. So sorry, kind of backing up for a second. In a kind of shaded or sort of a mimicking a forest type of setting, those ground covers are going to be things like ferns, right? In a sunnier setting, those ground covers are going to be things like grasses. You can also use some, perennials, blooming plants as ground covers in areas where I'm trying to kind of outcompete turf grass or some other really aggressive species, then, I might plant golden ragwort, Pachyra aurea is a really aggressive, shade-loving plant. Or I might plant mountain mint as a ground cover. This is a really aggressive native plant. I know that it's going to be able to hold its own if I'm really trying to kind of establish a space and compete with the plants that are already existing there. So this is what we should be replicating. And yes, da da da, this is doable at all scales. So an example of using layers of plants and planting densely in this patio back, it's not a yard, back patio. Um, there is no exposed soil here. We can't see the mulch. They're kind of using the walls of this patio to get some vertical height from these vines, but we even have some woody plants in containers, but then surrounded by, ground covers and seasonally blooming things. Okay, in my last 7 minutes, we're going to talk about how to make it cute, okay? And I once had the idea that it doesn't matter what my neighbors think. I'm going to plant how I know needs to be planted, and I think it looks beautiful, and so who cares what other people think? But actually, it's really important that we try to frame these messy ecosystems in some kind of orderly frame because we need to be the same. I mean, unless you live on like a remote, acreage, most of us are going to be surrounded by neighbors, and we really do need to be kind of sensitive to the fact that this has to work for us and all of our cultural expectations and expectations of cleanliness and safety and tidiness and all of those things. Most importantly, we really want this to catch on. So you can create your wildlife haven, but if your neighbors aren't appreciating it and taking it up on their own, then you're really kind of creating a habitat island, right? And so in order for this to catch on, we should be trying to make it as palatable as possible, and having those conversations with our neighbors so that we can try to make it catch on. So, in order to to frame it, we talk about cues to care. Lots of different examples here of some cues to care. One really important cue to care is having this, again, kind of like an overlapping sequence of visual interest. So those blooming times, making sure there's always something blooming. If there's nothing blooming, like, in the winter, then maybe some fruit, that hangs on in the winter, some kind of berries, some kind of really interesting looking seed heads, some evergreens, some kind of interesting bark or growth habit, some kind of interesting form. So, like some kind of visual interest in the garden at all times. This can be really, challenging to achieve. I'm not saying that this is easy. Another important cue to care is making use of mowed and mulched edges. Okay, so anytime you can introduce a pathway with a mowed edge, we have some mowed pathways down here, a mowed pathway in this image as well. Um, this planting is pretty wild by all accounts, right? There's lots of layers of vegetation happening here. But this is actually in somebody's front yard in Baltimore City. You can barely see the neighbor's house across the street in the corner up there. And so they are really intentional about having a nice clean edge to their flower bed, keeping it mulched and keeping the grass mowed right there. In the backyard, we can make different choices, right? So same home in the backyard, far fewer cues to care. Let's see. Pruning sight lines to your windows and your doors is another cue to care. So, making sure that at least in the front, you're kind of limbing things up or pruning things down so that you have sight lines to your windows and doors. So, your neighbors know that you're like okay inside. Any kind of structures, raised beds, fences, art or interpretive signage, all of those are going to be really good cues to care as well. That's why so many of these habitat programs have a sign. It's to recognize the gardener, but it's also to alert, passersby to the fact that the garden is intentional, right? It's not just kind of letting it go, pulling an Elsa, let it go, as my 3-year-old might say. But that it's really intentional choices and it's for the purposes of biodiversity. Depending on the size of your property, this can take a while. That's okay. We all start small. We all start somewhere. Every window box, tree pit, curb strip, boat, potted plant, right? All of these spaces add up, right? We truly never know where that exhausted individual bird is going to land. And so, collectively, this makes a really significant ecological contribution. And then individually also, you never know. You never know who's going to land there. I'm asked sometimes after these workshops, especially in the winter, what's something that I can do right now? Everyone, no matter what kind of space, wants to be able to get started and kind of keep their momentum going. So I have kind of a list of some things that you could start doing immediately. Today, maybe not today, it's already 8 o'clock at night. But maybe you're watching the recording and you have the whole day ahead of you. So today, so something everyone can do right now, first thing is if you have invasive plants on your property, try to identify them. You don't have to remove them all right now. It might not be immediately possible, but try to know what they are and make a plan for managing them. We used to have to like key things out with, maybe you're with me and do you remember how to use a field guide? Like, what's that? Um, Now we have all kinds of super helpful apps. The Picture This app is actually my favorite one for identifying plants. Also, we have an amazing local extension office with the University of Maryland, so please take advantage of their website. They actually have newly within the year a residential ecologist, I think is her title, as well as a native plant specialist. So people who have expertise in helping us to achieve everything that I'm talking about. Number two, meet your soils, because plant communities are communities because they are adapted to live together in particular kinds of soils. So you can look up your region, your plant hardiness zone, and your soil type and texture. Lots of information online. I wish I had time to tell you more about that, but I recommend investigating all of those things so that you can start to get an idea of what kind of plant community is going to thrive where you are. If you're planting in containers, you can, pretty much skip that step, right? You're going to be using potting soil. Third, we can start to map our properties, right? This is definitely something that is like a nice, cozy winter task. Get out your Google Earth measuring tool. Maybe you can start to identify and even measure some of your plants. How cool would that be? To be able to map out a plan of the different heights and widths of your existing plants, start to map out your property so that you know where you might want to start increasing habitat first. And then, okay, this one we can't do right now. This would have to wait until it gets warmer after the winter. But start with your tallest layer. Think about, where you want to start. And if you don't have somewhere obvious to start, like I usually tell people, if you have a spot that you hate to mow the grass, like a slope or a really wet area, like start your habitat garden there. But otherwise, plant your tallest layer. Plant your oak trees or serviceberry bushes or whatever the tallest layer is going to be. Plant those first. They take the longest to grow, and then you'll be able to, over time, kind of fill in the herbaceous layers around them. So that's going to be your task as soon as the ground thaws, which I'm pretty sure it's frozen right now. But maybe, again, maybe you're viewing this in warmer times and you can plant that first layer. My top two favorite native plant databases at the moment are the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay Native Plant Center. Now has, it used to be that amazing, I'm surprised I'm not surrounded by copies of them right now, I would show you, but it used to be this kind of published booklet thing with all the different plant species of the Chesapeake Bay. It's now a searchable database online. So, Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay Native Plant Center. You can search by the different kind of qualities in a plant that you are looking for. My other favorite is the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. The website is simply wildflower.org. You can only search by state, so you'll have to do your own narrowing down to get to our ecoregion. But that's where you can start. Okay, I'm only 3 minutes over, and then I'm just going to encourage everybody to keep in touch. Our website is getting a big shift in the coming months, so I would advise you to go to the website. Hopefully, Susie's been kind of putting some links into the chat. Go to the website and download any of those PDFs that you want, because this URL might change in the nearish future. So you're going to want to snag all of those. You can always shoot us an email. I have my direct email on my last slide. And then follow Audubon Mid-Atlantic on Instagram and Facebook. Keep up with us. Come out and see us in person. Volunteer like this awesome group in one of our habitat gardens. You can email me about that if that's something that you're interested in. Join us for another workshop in the spring. Also, in the spring, we start talking about how to use your voice to advocate for different, policies and plans that are going to benefit us, the green spaces in our neighborhoods, and of course, the birds that use them. So, with that, I'll say thank you again for inviting me this evening. Thank you again so much for being here on a cold night, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Put your questions in the chat, please. I have one or two here. I'll send those to you while some folks put some more in the chat. I did just share some links that you mentioned, so folks, please save those for later. The first is, what plants could I grow in large containers that will be tall-ish as an upper layer for a row house yard? I did share the top 10 lists, which includes a list of container favorites, but maybe you could comment on the height question there.
Yeah, I mean, The height question, it's honestly if you're growing in a patio garden, I would think more about the width than about the height. So if you have a patio, and it's, let's say, 15 feet wide, you're maybe not going to want 10 feet of it, or maybe you do, to be taken up by like one giant shrub. So I would think about plant widths. Um, I mean, the top tens for containers is where I would go. So anything that is, in the size width that you want it to be, that can tolerate dry soil. I've at this point got my containers hooked up to a drip irrigation system because I was so bad at watering them. And I wanted, my vegetable garden to survive also. But even in, the hottest days of summer, getting watered once or twice a day is like too harsh to be in a container for some species. So I would definitely look for things that are drought tolerant.
Mary has a raised hand. Are you able to type your question in the chat, or would you like to come off mute? Is that okay, Morgan? If someone comes off mute.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem.
Okay, Mary, who had your hand up?
Maybe it was an accidental hand raising, or maybe it was a high five.
I'll think of it as a high five. I'm sorry we don't have the reactions.
If you have a question and you want to come off mute, feel free. I think our group is small enough that I can offer that. If there were like 300 people, I'd be like, "Mm, maybe not."
Now we've got the bird puns starting in the chat.
Wait, I'm missing bird puns? Oh my gosh.
All right, hold
I
on, their
have,
questions. My backyard has a downward slope about 4 feet high that's covered in concrete chunks. What could I plant over that to help encourage native plant growth? Right now, all that's there is English ivy.
okay. All of this information is extremely useful. Because, so the first thing that I hope that everybody takes away is that there is virtually no scenario that exists on any of our properties that nothing will grow, right? Like there are ecosystems in the world that, right? Lots of things that can grow in rocky soil. Uh-oh, am I still with you? I just got like a internet
You're back.
connection
Maybe repeat the
unstable
last
signal.
30 seconds. Can you hear
Okay,
me? Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
I was saying that, there are very few scenarios in our property that, there's not a plant community that would be adapted to that property. So, um, a property or a land, whatever, soil that's covered in concrete chunks is basically just like really rocky soil, right? So if we find a plant community that is adapted to grow in really rocky soils, which we certainly have in the Piedmont, which is our ecoregion, then those plants would probably be fine if you didn't want to remove those concrete chunks. I would say the most informative part of this question is the part about it being covered in English ivy, because that tells me that you need something really aggressive that can kind of like take on that English ivy, at least, start to um, like switch over that space, get the English ivy out first, which depending on the scale of what we're talking about here, might be like its own challenge. You might have to do kind of one section at a time. I'm not seeing about whether it's sunny or shady, but English ivy likes shade, so I'm gonna go with shade. Um, so look at the top tens. I'm gonna make up, I know we like talk about the top tens, but the great thing about the top tens is that it's actually the top 10 plant genera. So it's an entire genus of plants. Within each of those, there might be several species of plants that can be adapted to your space. So if you know that you need to stay within the sumac genus, then you can, like find a species that is adapted to the conditions that you have. The reason that I thought of sumac is one of my big go-tos for a slope is aromatic sumac. I try really hard, by the way. Everybody wants me to like design their properties in these workshops, and it's really difficult because unless I've seen your soil and your sunlight, I'm going to tell you a species of plant, and then maybe it's not going to thrive, and then you're going to be like, that bird lady sent me astray. Um, I happen to know that aromatic sumac, Rhus aromatica, is really hardy, can grow on like a rock wall. It does like some sun, but maybe it could get away with a little bit of shade. And there's a cultivar that grows really low. It's actually the grow low cultivar. It only gets a couple feet tall, but it gets like 10 feet wide, so it can kind of like spread out along a slope. I really love it for that. Um, but yeah, I mean, basically what this person is describing is all the conditions that you need to know to kind of like put into a plant database and be able to narrow down your choices. So use the top tens to narrow down your choices. Use the rocky soil to narrow down your choices. Use the fact that it has to be kind of an aggressive competitor because it needs to compete with English ivy. And that's going to help you within these, online plant databases. And also just like what's available if you're, purchasing plants at a nursery, what's available is often like an important limiting factor. But that's what's going to help you kind of narrow down your choices. And that's probably better than me telling you a species when I haven't seen, your soils or know anything about what you want your space to look like.
Thank you. There are a couple more questions here. Next one is, what are the benefits of fruit trees? Presumably the question is to birds, since we're talking about
Yeah.
birds. Yeah.
So I included fruit, berries, in my bird food pyramid. Mostly they're important because the fruits from native plants in particular are really fatty. So they're full of sugar and fat. And that is particularly important when birds are migrating in the fall. So birds are burning lots of calories, of course. And the timing of the ripening of our native berry and fruit producing plants is in sync with when those birds are migrating in the fall. So hugely beneficial for our fall time migration. Um, if you, I mean, yeah, the benefit of fruit trees is kind of like a broad question. But I really like several species of fruit producing plants that are also edible to humans. So service berries are a good example of that. Our blueberries are a good example of that. As I'm reading it and I'm seeing fruit trees, that makes me think perhaps you're asking about um, like cherry or apple trees. And I would say if we're talking about kind of like non-native or cultivated or where you can kind of like graft different fruit trees, that's not the direction I would head in to benefit birds. Like yes, you can see kind of like insect pollinators being attracted, but there's not that kind of shared evolutionary history with those cultivated plants. And actually a lot of times this is sort of like outside of my expertise a little bit, but when you kind of graft or cultivate those plants, sometimes they can be sterile as well, right? So, if we're hoping to kind of like maintain the genetic diversity of our wild spaces, then it's maybe not the direction that I would head in. Of course, planting fruit trees is like amazing for other reasons. I can only answer the question as like a bird, um, like benefit to birds. Don't
I'm
go
gonna
out
give
there
you
and be like, Audubon said that orchards are bad. It's not what I said.
okay, okay. Um, sorry, I was sort of debating how to feed you this one question because I've given some support to it because there's sort of a design question. So I shared the link to the design templates that you had pulled together that folks seem to like for various sunshade, wet, dry conditions. Anyway, let me not stop trying to answer it for you. I'll read it to you and you can take it how you might offer some advice. It says, I have to plant new natives over a number of years. My concern is planning for the ultimate design, but it looks good now as I continually add to it. I planted 3 oaks this fall. I have a red maple, 2 service berries, a cherry, 3 arrowwoods. I have a few native forbs at the edges, but want to add to it over time. What initial thoughts would you say? Did you try this? How about that? Um,
Yeah.
I'll let you take it.
Yeah, I see this question as kind of that. This is sort of like a very common question of like, how do you plan for the succession of your space? Because right now, you're planting little bitty trees and it's that's kind of where you're putting your efforts. And there's probably still a whole lot of sun getting through underneath those trees. But you know that eventually they're going to grow and kind of shade out those things. So we're trying to mimic succession, which is like how native habitats kind of move from a meadow, a full sun situation to like an old growth forest over many, many, many years. And I think that's kind of the thing to keep in mind when I get this question. It's really tricky because I think the answer that people want to get is, oh, well, here's a perennial or a ground cover that can tolerate sun and shade. So you could plant it today while it's getting a lot of sun. If I'm totally off base for your question, please, let me know. But um, and okay, so this species can tolerate a lot of sun, and then, in 10 years, there will be more shade and it'll be just as happy as well. That might be the case. There are species that have like a wide range of sun tolerance, but I think the kind of important thing to remember is that habitats in our outdoor spaces, if we're designing them in this way, they're kind of meant to evolve. So this is sort of a mindset shift of like, I'm going to plant these species in these specific spots, and that's where they're going to stay forever. And that's not really how it's going to work, right? Because by the time those oak trees are, big enough to shade, we're talking about years and years, right? Well, maybe you have planted some sun-loving thing underneath of those plants that you could move to a different place. Maybe those plants have kind of moved themselves to a different place, and that's okay. So my advice is always to just plan for the conditions you have now. Because if you're thinking like, I have all of these trees and shrubs, they're little bitty. I know that I want to create this kind of forest floor scenario. And so I'm going to plant like shade-loving ferns and things. Well, they're going to get like crispy fried by the sun, right? So they're not going to survive to turn into your forest floor scenario. I think plant for the conditions that you have now, count the number of, hours of sunlight. If, over the years things are changing, I'm kind of at this position in my yard now. I've been here since 2016, been planting things since 2017. And it's about time that like, oh wow, I have some like nice sized trees and shrubs, and areas that I had planted for full sun are now not, full sun anymore. And so I'm thinking about, where can I move these plants to other areas, or, maybe I can give them away to somebody who is just starting out and start to kind of like feed in some more shade loving things. Okay, I know this is like a fire hose of an answer, but I have one more piece of advice. So if you plant layers of forbs, then that means that you can have like taller perennials that might be more sun loving intermixed with shorter ground covers that might be more shade loving, right? They're going to get shaded out by those taller herbaceous plants. So that's another way to kind of like have a mix that might be maybe better able to evolve over time. It's maybe not the answer everybody is hoping for, but that's the answer that I have.
I think even if it wasn't, there was lots of good advice in that answer. And we're getting, thank you very much, kinds of answers and accolades and gratitude in the chat. So I think we might be finished with the questions. If you have any final words, and then Morgan, I assume you'll wrap us up. Can I reiterate one more thing, which is just to
Oh,
see you see you in the spring, hopefully. For having registered today, you'll be on the Audubon mailing list, so you'll find out what's coming up, what's happening, and you'll see the more in-depth um, gardening workshops coming up in the spring. All right, one more question snuck in while I was saying that. So we'll do one more question and then wrap us up. Should everyone plant an evergreen for winter, is the question.
yeah, I'm not going to say like everyone needs to plant an evergreen. I think if it's kind of in your space and conditions, it's definitely one of those cues to care that you can introduce for some winter interest. Um, there are some, there are also some species that are kind of semi-evergreen that can kind of like mimic an evergreen. So it's yes, I would say plan for some winter visual interest. Something that has kind of like retains broad leaves covering the ground is really nice because it's sort of like, holds some warmth in the ground. Um, but yeah, I think evergreens, but also, things that have overwintering berries, things that have interesting bark, like all of those are ways to, add some visual interest. And also, when you have kind of like a density of vegetation during the winter, it's a great place for birds and other critters to be able to find some shelter. Definitely a good thing to do if you can.
Awesome. Morgan, I'm going to hand it to you. Would you mind reiterating about the recording and how folks can find that and wrap us up? Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Erin. Thank you so much, Susie. This has been a wonderful presentation. I just love to see people who are so passionate about collaborating with nature and creating regenerative ecosystems to support our more than human communities. So, thank you so much. This recording will be sent out to everyone who registered through our Eventbrite. And I will put my email in the chat in case somehow you got this link and you didn't register through Eventbrite and you still want the recording. It'll also be available on our YouTube channel, which will be sent out as well, along with the links and resources that were put in the chat today. So, my email is in the chat if you, yeah, want to reach out and you didn't register and so on the recording. So, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to everyone who asked all of these great questions. I personally learned a lot. I hope you did too. And I wish everyone a wonderful winter and, yeah, a happy start to their spring when they start implementing some of these ideas. So, thank you so much, everyone.